This topic has been bothering me for some time. Recently, I started putting, these hashtags we have on Instagram and LinkedIn postings. I started putting peace and world peace in all my climate podcasts because I believe that militaries, the way they are going, of course, they spend a lot. We always talk about the unaccounted for emissions from defense operations, training, their infrastructure in military industrial complex, etc. And obviously, we need to understand those better. But I'm also worried more about how militaries are beginning to play a role directly in actions that affect climate change. For example, militaries are beginning to protect resources like rare earth elements, which are critical for EVs, renewables, and various climate solutions. And I even pitched an article to an editor of a journal, a magazine that I write to often, saying I can write on the role of military spending on climate action and climate mitigation. This group has written this article in Nature Communications that just came out in June 2025, and I'm recording this also in June 2025. This is, I think something that's really important, and yet it may not be very easy to get a hold on this problem. So this says rising military spending jeopardizes climate targets. I'm going to be very brief. We'll just look at the abstract and the discussion with some words and figures from the main text of the paper. The IPCC's sixth assessment report highlights the reliance on sustainable socioeconomic pathways to meet the 1.5 degree C or 2 degree C targets. However, these scenarios lack a quantitative assessment of the impact of global military spending on CO2 emissions. Our study shows that events such as the 2001-2011 war on terrorism and the 2022 Russian-Ukrainian war led to an increase in CO2 emissions intensity of 0.04 kilograms per US dollar for every 1% escalation in global military expenditure as a percentage of GDP, the MILEX ratio, military expenditure versus GDP. This increase accounts for 27% of the total change in CO2 emissions intensity between 1995 and 2023. So, CO2 per unit of GDP is the CO2 intensity. You often do carbon intensity of energy, but you can also do CO2 intensity of GDP. Anyways, in this context, that makes more sense. In scenarios where the global MILEX ratio exceeds the thresholds of 12% for, IPCC scenario SSP 1-1.9, or 24% for SSP 1-2.6, the 1.5 degree C or 2 degree C climate goals would become, MILEX ratio exceeds 12% for SSP 1 and 24% for SSP 2.6. These are the two scenarios for staying under 1.5 by 2100 and 2 degree C under 2100, with lots of assumptions in the scenarios. So they would basically become unattainable by the end of the century based on these percentages of MILEX ratio, highlighting the urgent need for a more peaceful international environment to effectively limit global warming. The examples here are the Russian-Ukrainian war and the war on terrorism, of course, which was led by the US, but I should mention that all the authors on this paper are from China, so we have to keep that in mind. And it's not just military action that matters. When we say military expenditure, there are a lot of, mock exercises, drills, training programs, sorties of, aircrafts, fighter jets, this, that go on. And those also contribute, so it doesn't have to be that there is a conflict to increase military expenditure. The competition, geopolitical tensions, real or imagined, in the South Asian region between India and the neighboring countries, US, China, there are all kinds of tensions that drive military expenditure and sales of weapons, military, instruments or not instruments, whatever, guns and tanks and everything else, aircrafts, that's massive business as well. So all these things matter in terms of military expenditure, and as I said, my broader interest is to see what role military will play directly in climate actions. Will it be helpful or will it be protective of one's own resources, so overall negatively impact global actions, right? Nonetheless, this paper has some good points. Global geopolitics since 2022 has witnessed considerable complexity and instability, which has been unparalleled since the end of the Cold War. Events such as the Russo-Ukrainian war since 2022 and the Gaza war since 2023 have profound implications on political and security dynamics in Eurasia, so this has a certain angle for sure. These conflicts could intensify climate change vulnerability, hinder climate mitigation efforts, and obstruct multilateral climate action. It's vital to address the gap in understanding the interplay between socio-political risks and climate change mitigation. Quantifying the impact of escalating global tensions or conflicts on the climate is crucial for formulating effective policy responses and fostering global cooperation in tackling both climate change and geopolitical challenges. The basic idea is very solid, even though examples used kind of miss some of the main expenditures that are not related to active conflicts, as I said. In this study, we utilize historical data and statistical methodologies to investigate the relationship between global military expenditure milex as a fraction of GDP, expressed as a percentage of GDP, hereafter referred to as milex ratio, and CO2 emissions intensity. We employ correlation analysis and linear regression to modeling the quantification of this relationship, complemented by significance test, uncertainty analysis, and so on, and they scrutinize the composition of or related emissions and evaluate the impacts of unaccounted emissions from wars on this estimation of the milex ratio. Again, the focus is on active conflicts, but we have to worry about all military activities, even in their own borders. So obviously the shared socioeconomic pathways mentioned here, SSP 1-1.9 and SSP 1-2.6, correspond to shared socioeconomic pathway 1, which is the best in terms of the chance of keeping global warming below 1.5 and 2 degrees C. 1.9 and 2.6 here refer to the net radiative forcing that would result from the emissions related to these pathways. So how much additional energy imbalance will occur by 2100. Okay, keeping that in mind, let's just look at some figures. There is some supplementary material for details. I'm being very brief because I just want to make the point that this is something we must worry about even as a scenario. CO2 emissions intensity, basically tons per unit of GDP, total emissions divided by GDP. Okay, total CO2 emissions intensity in kilograms per US dollar. Phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, so global milex ratio and weighted global milex ratio. There are some details on how this is done, so you can read that, but you can see weighted global milex ratio has a significant relation and regression with detrended CO2 emission intensity. So the relationship between global military expenditure ratio and global CO2 emissions intensity, time series of detrended global CO2 emissions per unit of GDP, so that's emission intensity in kilograms per US dollar in constant 2017 purchasing power parity, that takes care of currency differences. This is represented by the blue line here, just the CO2 emissions versus milex, so year. Okay, and three-year weighted average global milex ratio, red line, from 1995 to 2023. So that's total expenditure. Global MILEX ratios for 1995 and 1996 are not weighted. The study period is divided into 4 phases, showcasing a relative peaceful phase highlighted with a light green background. So phase 1 peaceful, maybe this is also phase of frequent regional wars marked with a light orange background. So the idea is that the expenditures MILEX ratio or CO2 emission intensity have a relation to wars, active conflicts. The boxes below display the major events of war. So you have post-Cold War, some calm in the global context of geopolitics, Operation Enduring Freedom, so that's the so-called war on terror. Iraq war was part of it. After global financial crisis, again there was a bit of dip in CO2 emissions related to financial, industrial activities and general overall spending, and then came COVID pandemic and Russia-Ukraine war, so we are ramping back up. So MILEX ratios do have ups and downs, and they are saying they are related to active conflicts, which basically means there is a background spending which is not being accounted for here, right? Each country is spending massively each year on militaries, which obviously are included, but the rates or CO2 emission intensity can be misleading in that sense. Okay, so the next figure is on global CO2 emissions in the 5 baseline shared socioeconomic pathways and the sensitivity scenarios with various global military spending. I'm not a big fan of projections beyond about a couple of decades because scenarios completely determine the uncertainties in them, but nonetheless expenditure ratios can be varied, decrease by -2% expenditure ratio, plus 5%, plus 10% for SSP 1.9, so annual CO2 emissions will go down, but you can see as expenditures go up, the drop becomes slower. That's the impact on climate mitigation. Obviously the numbers are different in terms of gigatons of CO2 for higher emission scenarios of SSP 1 2.6 gets worse for 4.5 and so on. In each case you see that increasing military expenditures in the scenarios will increase the annual CO2 emissions. Just to revisit the scenarios, you have radiative forcing by 2100, which we mentioned as 1.9 and 2.6 for SSP1 here. SSP2 goes here at 4.5. I think this is SSP4 is not shown here, but SSP3 7 here is regional rivalry, which relates to, this is the middle of the road, regional rivalry, which will correspond to military spending, and fossil fuel developments, of course, is business as usual, which is basically not an option anymore because everybody is participating and everybody is submitting NDCs, following up even for their own energy security and so on with renewables, etc., especially China and even India and so on. Cumulative CO2 emissions in gigaton since 1850. So you have the benign scenarios give you these numbers. Cumulative CO2 emission is important because that is linearly proportional to the warming rates, warming as well. 2050 and 2099. So in the benign scenario we drop back, even though higher in the worst case scenario. So these are business as usual versus benign scenarios. Green and blue are good ones, but nonetheless you can see 2.6 goes higher, the numbers are different, 3200 max here, 3750, 5500, 8000 and more than 10,000 here. So you get the idea that their calculations adding military expenditure ratios into scenarios basically slows down mitigation efforts. Another way to think about it, projections of global surface temperature increases in baseline SSPs and sensitivity scenarios with varied global military expenditure. So you can see 1.5 line is here, and your 1.6 and 1.9 should bring you back by different timelines here out to 2070 or so. But with increasing, if you decrease military expenditure, you will accelerate the impact on mitigation, which is a good thing. But if military expenditure ratios increase, then we are not going to hit the 1.5 at all. And this is similarly for SSP 1 2.6. This is for 1.9 2.6. Obviously here you are aiming for staying under 2 degrees C warming by 2100 with a 67% probability and so on. So let's just jump to discussion. This research reveals a statistically significant positive correlation between the global Milex ratio and the detrended global CO2 emission intensity from 1995 to 2023. Specifically, a 1% increase in global Milex ratio corresponds to a change of 0.04 kilogram per USD of carbon intensity in global CO2 emission intensity. The country level analysis reveals that military activities, especially within the military industries, are typically more carbon intensive than civil sectors, so they do mention it here. For example, the emission intensity of the US military industry was estimated to be nearly twice the national average during the period of 2018-19. An increase in a country's Milex ratio generally correlates with an expansion of military-related activities, resulting in higher carbon emissions. Again, only US number is mentioned here because that's publicly available. This trend is further amplified on a global scale through international trade and military supply chains, including weapon sales and, of course, military bases in various regions for cornering resources or protecting their interests, economic and otherwise, and so on. The finding addresses a critical knowledge gap in understanding how rising military spending prompted by geopolitical tensions influences climate change mitigation efforts. Escalating global tensions with a Milex ratio exceeding 12% or 24% would critically jeopardize our ability to prevent the climate system from reaching dangerous greenhouse gas concentration levels even under the most optimistic scenario of SSP 1 1.9 and SSP 1 2.6 respectively. This study focuses on emissions directly linked to military bases, operations and supply chains, while the impacts of post-conflict reconstruction and the destruction of carbon reservoirs on CO2 emissions intensity are negligible during our study period. They could be more pronounced in the event of a large-scale war, and there are debates about whether there will ever be another world war because economic interests are all closely tied together, but lots of proxy wars go on. So Israel-Gaza war was mentioned here, but many non-local parties are involved in various ways, and it's the same with any other conflict you can think of, right? So it's not as simple as just pointing to one war and trying to blame, trying to attribute responsibilities. And anyway, future research will require extensive data collection and analysis to explore whether the widespread adoption of renewable energy, green military technologies, and shifting global trade patterns could weaken the link between military expenditures and carbon emissions, or whether heightened global tensions could indirectly hinder climate action and reinforce this relationship. So we have talked a lot about decarbonization as a way out. So here our findings indicate that escalating global military spending threatens global climate goals, underscoring the need for peace and technological advancements to combat climate change. Achieving the 1.5 degrees C or 2 degrees C climate targets and mitigating the risk of extreme temperatures require a stable international environment and strong international cooperation. All good, but if you just look at the surreptitious and implicit actions in outside the borders of a particular country, what a country does outside its borders often depends on gaining economic advantage or cornering resources or killing competition in very explicit and implicit ways and so on. So peace will mean a lot more than just reducing military spending in that way. It's a non-zero sum game. Everybody can benefit with economic development, but that's not how the world works. To integrate military emissions into international climate frameworks, we suggest mandatory military emissions reporting under the UNFCCC framework and advancing the green transition of the military sector through the targeted policies. So we are not saying abandon militaries. So if you keep militaries, and what is the problem in just disbanding them if such peace is possible? So there are always kind of contradictory messages when we say we need militaries, but they don't have to compete with each other. So these measures could include incorporating military emissions in nationally determined contributions, establishing independent verification mechanisms, and promoting multilateral agreements to reduce the military sector's carbon footprint. So if we decarbonize the entire system, will we then have somehow militaries that are not emitting but still are cornering all the climate relevant resources like rare earth elements, which will indirectly prevent climate mitigation at a global scale anyways. So it's a very complicated issue, but this paper is a good start on just thinking about military expenditure and its role in carbon intensity at a global scale here. But obviously we have to, if we come down to the NDC level, then they have to become part of the country level emissions and overall commitment to climate mitigation as well. Okay, so world peace would be great. Whether it can happen with militaries or without militaries is a detail that we'll have to worry about, but if we make progress towards peace, it'll be fantastic, right?